She called me the help. To my face, while I stood in her foyer wearing my grandmother's earrings, holding a glass of water I hadn't asked for, smiling like I hadn't heard every single word. That was the moment I knew this family had no idea who they were dealing with, and by the end of this story, neither will you. Welcome to my channel. My channel name is The Revenge Room. My name is Ella Graham. I'm 32 years old, and for the past 14 months, I let the man I was engaged to believe I was broke. Not because I'm a liar, not because I was playing games, but because my grandmother taught me something that changed the way I see people forever. She told me that a person's true character only shows when they think no one important is watching. When they believe you have nothing to offer them, that's when you see who they really are. So, when Marcus Whitmore invited me to dinner at his family's estate, I made a decision. I would show up exactly as they expected me to. Modest dress, old car, no jewelry worth noticing, and I would watch. Here's what they didn't know. I'm a senior software architect at one of the largest tech companies in the Pacific Northwest. I've been writing code since I was 15. I sold my first app at 22. I hold 3 patents. I make $37,000 a month before taxes, and I have stock options that would make a banker's eyes water. Marcus thought I was an administrative assistant who barely made rent. He assumed it. I never corrected him. When we first met at a coffee shop 14 months ago, he asked what I did, and I said I worked in tech. He nodded, then asked if I handled scheduling for the executives. I smiled and said something vague about supporting the team. He filled in the blanks himself. That's on him. The reason I could pull this off, the reason I didn't flinch when people underestimated me, came from the most important person in my life. My grandmother raised me after my parents died when I was 7. She drove an older car. She shopped at regular stores. She never wore anything flashy. What I didn't know until she passed, when I was 24, was that she was worth several $1,000,000. She had built a business empire, invested wisely, and chosen to live simply because she believed character mattered more than appearance. She left me everything, along with a letter I still keep in my nightstand. That letter is the reason I walked into the Whitmore estate wearing drugstore earrings and a plain navy dress instead of the truth. The Whitmore estate was exactly what you'd expect from new money trying to pass as old money. The iron gates had gold accents because apparently plain iron wasn't pretentious enough. The lawn looked like someone measured every blade of grass. The driveway was longer than some streets I've lived on. As I pulled up in my 12-year-old Subaru, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror and smiled. I looked exactly like someone who didn't belong there. Perfect. Marcus met me at the door with a kiss that felt slightly performed, like he was doing it for an audience. His eyes drifted over my outfit, and I caught it. Just a flicker. Embarrassment. He was embarrassed by how I looked. I filed that away immediately. Inside, the house was cold despite all its opulence. Crystal chandeliers in every room, oil paintings in gilded frames that turned out to be prints, not originals, furniture chosen to impress rather than to sit on. And standing in the foyer like a queen reviewing her subjects was Patricia Whitmore. Early 60s, surgeon-assisted face, hair lacquered into a helmet, designer dress, real jewelry, completely fake smile. She extended her hand like she was doing me a favor. I shook it and felt nothing but dismissal. Then she leaned toward Marcus and whispered, loud enough for me to hear every word, that I looked like the help who had wandered in the wrong entrance. I kept smiling. I kept my face perfectly, beautifully neutral, because I already knew something Patricia Whitmore didn't. This evening wasn't going to end the way she planned. What would you do if someone insulted you the moment you walked through the door? Let me know in the comments and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because this story is just getting started.
The dining room was a stage set for humiliation, and Patricia Whitmore was the director. 6 forks at every place setting. 6! I counted them. I've seen surgeries performed with fewer instruments. The chandelier threw sharp light across the table like a spotlight, and every question Patricia asked felt rehearsed. She started with where I had grown up. Small town in Oregon, I said. True. She asked about my family. My grandmother raised me. Also true. She asked what my parents did. They passed when I was young. Her response was a sound that was supposed to be sympathetic, but came out like a drain unclogging. She said how difficult it must have been growing up without proper guidance. I told her my grandmother had provided all the guidance I ever needed. That was when Vivian arrived, 20 minutes late, draped in diamonds, with the energy of someone who considered punctuality beneath her. Her greeting to me was a single word, "Hello," delivered with a slight curl of the lip, like she'd smelled something she couldn't identify. She immediately turned to her mother and started a conversation that excluded me entirely, something about a florist who needed to be fired. I stood, holding my water glass, feeling about as welcome as a fire alarm at a dinner party. Marcus hovered nearby and said absolutely nothing. That was the second thing I filed away. He wasn't just weak around his family, he was complicit. Patricia continued probing my background with surgical precision. When I mentioned my grandmother had been a businesswoman, Vivian leaned forward and asked what kind of business. I said small ventures, nothing too exciting. The truth was, my grandmother had built and sold a company for several $1,000,000, but that truth wasn't useful yet. Patricia moved on to my job. I said I worked in tech. She asked if I was a secretary. I said I was more of a support role, which was technically accurate. She nodded with the satisfaction of someone confirming their lowest expectation. She said every team needed support staff. Marcus shifted in his chair and stayed silent. Then Vivian dropped the name, Alexandra. Casual, deliberate, perfectly timed. She had run into Alexandra last week, she said. Alexandra was doing wonderfully. Patricia picked up the thread immediately, explaining that Alexandra had been Marcus's girlfriend for 3 years, that everyone had expected them to end up together, that her family owned a luxury vehicle import company which would have been such a perfect match for the Whitmore dealerships. The implication needed no translation. Alexandra was the right choice. I was not. I turned slightly and noticed photographs on the wall behind me. Family moments, Christmases, graduations. In at least 4 of them, a beautiful, dark-haired woman stood beside Marcus, arm linked through his, smiling like she already owned the room. Patricia said nothing. Her satisfaction was almost visible. I turned back and smiled. I said Alexandra sounded like a remarkable woman. Vivian blinked. That was not the response she had rehearsed for. Patricia recovered faster and said yes, Alexandra was remarkable, then added with zero subtlety that she hoped I wouldn't feel too out of place, given your more modest background. I asked what she meant by modest. She smiled with teeth and said there was no shame in being common. Common. She called me common. I felt something shift inside me, not hurt, something colder, more focused. I stored that word somewhere I wouldn't forget it. What would you do if someone called you common to your face at a dinner table? Tell me in the comments, because what happened next is where this story changes completely. After the dessert, the group dispersed. Patricia disappeared to speak with the housekeeper. Vivian excused herself. I slept away to find the bathroom. What I found instead was a partially open door, and 2 voices I recognized. Patricia's voice, sharp and low, and Vivian's. Every instinct said keep walking. I stopped. Patricia was saying they needed to handle the situation quickly, that Marcus couldn't be allowed to make this mistake. Vivian said she had assumed I was just a phase. Patricia said this was more serious than a diet. Then came the part that made my blood run cold. The Whitmore dealerships were in serious financial trouble. The merger with Alexandra's family, the Castellanos, was the only thing that could save them. Marcus was supposed to keep Alexandra interested while the deal was finalized. Patricia confirmed he had been keeping his options open with her, while engaged with me. Then Vivian said the thing that sealed their fate. She said at least the girl was too stupid to suspect anything, that I was naive, trusting, probably just grateful someone like Marcus had noticed me at all. I stepped back from the door. My hands were shaking, but not from heartbreak, from clarity. They thought I was stupid. My grandmother's voice came back, steady and certain. When someone underestimates you, she used to say, they have given you a gift. I walked to the bathroom, ran cold water over my wrists, looked at myself in the mirror, and made a decision. I was going to say yes. Marcus got down on one knee in the sitting room with 100 guests worth of planning behind him, and a ring that looked impressive in dim light but wouldn't survive a closer look, much like the man holding it. The diamond was cloudy, the setting uneven. It was chosen for appearance rather than quality, which I was beginning to understand was the Whitmore family philosophy applied to everything, including people. Behind him, Patricia was beaming with the energy of a woman executing a plan she had rehearsed. This was step one: get Marcus publicly committed to me, then dismantle the relationship at their convenience once Alexandra was secured. I understood all of it in a single heartbeat, and I said yes anyway. The crowd applauded. Patricia clapped like she was at a theater performance. Vivian offered congratulations with the warmth of a January morning. Harold shook Marcus's hand and said he had done well. Richard Hartley, the mysterious family friend who had been watching me all evening with that quiet, searching expression, caught my eye from across the room. Something in his face told me he suspected this story had more chapters. I smiled at him, and he smiled back. The champagne came out, the toasts began, and I played the role of the glowing, grateful fiancé with the commitment of someone who had been saving this performance for exactly the right moment. The next morning, I started my research. If there is one thing my career has taught me, it is the power of information. I spend my days analyzing systems, identifying weaknesses, building solutions. I was about to apply every one of those skills to the Whitmore family. What I found over the following days confirmed everything I had heard through that door, and then went several steps further. The dealerships were not just struggling, they were hemorrhaging. They had expanded aggressively during boom years, taken on debt that made no structural sense, and now the bills were arriving all at once. Their primary franchise agreement was up for renewal, and the manufacturer was already exploring other options. The Castellano partnership was not a growth strategy, it was a life raft. Without it, the Whitmore empire would sink within a fiscal year. But that was not the most interesting thing I found. As I dug deeper into the financial records, a pattern emerged that was too consistent to be accidental. Small amounts at first, buried in expense reports and petty cash accounts, the kind of numbers that get lost in the noise of a large operation. But over the years, those numbers had grown, and the destination was always the same. Vivian Whitmore had been stealing from her own family's company for years. The total had climbed into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, funding a lifestyle that her official salary could never have supported. The diamonds, the designer wardrobe, the lavish vacations, all of it built on money quietly drained from a business that was already dying. I printed everything and added it to a file that was growing thicker by the day. Then I made a phone call that changed the shape of everything. My grandmother's name still carried weight in certain business circles. The contacts she had built over decades remembered the Graham family with genuine respect. One of those contacts knew Richard Hartley personally, and Richard, it turned out, had a history with the Whitmores that had never been resolved. 15 years ago, they had cheated him on a business deal, nothing that crossed into criminal territory, but unethical enough to leave a lasting wound. He had been waiting for an opportunity ever since. When I reached out and explained what I had found, he didn't hesitate. He said he had his own documentation, his own records of questionable Whitmore dealings over the years, and he was more than willing to share. We began meeting in secret, building something neither of us could have assembled alone. Meanwhile, I kept playing my role. I attended family dinners at the estate and smiled through Patricia's passive-aggressive commentary. I watched Vivian flaunt her stolen wardrobe and said nothing. I let Marcus hold my hand at social events while his phone buzzed with messages he angled away from me. I already knew the name that kept appearing on that screen. One evening, I told Marcus I was working late. Instead, I parked near the restaurant where he claimed to be meeting a client. He was not meeting a client. He was meeting Alexandra. I watched through the window as they sat at a corner table, heads close together, body language unmistakably intimate. At one point, he took her hand across the table. At another, she laughed at something he said and touched his face. I took photographs. not for any legal purpose. I took them because I wanted to remember exactly who Marcus Whitmore really was when he thought no one important was watching. The night before the engagement party, I gave him one final chance to be honest. We were at his apartment going over party details, and I asked him casually how he felt about our future. He said he was excited. He couldn't wait to marry me. I asked if there was anything he wanted to tell me, anything at all. He looked at me with those blue eyes I had once found charming, and said there was nothing. He said I was everything he had ever wanted. I asked about Alexandra. His face went pale. He recovered quickly, but I had already seen the flash of fear. He said she was just an old friend, nothing more. I nodded and said I understood, and in that moment I truly understood. Marcus would never tell me the truth. He would look me in the eye and lie for as long as it served his purpose. He was his mother's son in every way that mattered. The engagement party was set for the following evening. Patricia had transformed the estate into something between a royal garden party and a corporate showcase. White tents on the manicured lawn, crystal chandeliers suspended from temporary structures, a string quartet by the fountain, waitstaff circulating with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more per bite than some people's hourly wage. She had invited everyone who mattered in the regional automotive industry, business partners, franchise contacts, competitors, journalists. This was not just a celebration, this was a performance designed to announce the Whitmore family's continued dominance. She had no idea she was building the perfect stage for her own exposure. The night of the party, I stood in front of my mirror in my real apartment, wearing a dress from my real closet, deep emerald green, custom fitted by a designer's whose name alone opened doors, my grandmother's diamond pendant at my throat, appraised at more than most cars, a limited edition watch that only 50 people in the world owned. I looked at the woman in the mirror and felt something settle into place. For 14 months I had been hiding. Tonight I was done. Are you ready for what happened when I walked through those gates? Because the Whitmore family was about to meet Ella Graham for the very first time. The valet at the Whitmore estate looked at my Subaru like it had driven in from a different dimension. One of them actually asked if I was with the catering company. I smiled, handed him my keys, and walked toward the main tent like I owned every inch of ground beneath my feet. With every step, I felt the persona I had been wearing for weeks fall away. The nervous girlfriend, the grateful fiancé, the simple woman who should have been thankful for Patricia Whitmore's grudging tolerance. Gone. Tonight, I was Ella Graham, the real one, and the real one was about to introduce herself. The first person to notice the shift was a woman near the tent entrance whose eyes went wide and then immediately went to her companion with a whisper. The second was Harold Whitmore himself, stationed near the bar performing his host duties with tired enthusiasm. When he saw me, his welcoming smile froze mid-formation. His eyes traveled from my face to my dress to my jewelry and back again, running the calculation and coming up with an answer that didn't match anything he had been told about me. I said good evening and thanked him for the lovely party. He stammered something about being glad I could make it, still trying to solve the equation I presented. I moved on before he could ask questions. Word travels fast in a room full of people who measure everything by appearances. I could feel it spreading as I moved through the crowd, the whispers, the sidelong glances, the subtle phone checks as guests tried to place me. I stopped to introduce myself to several people along the way, giving my full name and my company each time. The company name landed like a quiet explosion in every conversation. Recognition, recalibration. One man, a silver-haired dealer who ran a competing chain, said his nephew worked in tech and had mentioned my name in connection with some innovative software solutions. A woman handling mergers for a major investment firm asked if I was related to Margaret Graham. When I said she was my grandmother, the woman's expression shifted into something close to reverence. She said the Graham name still carried significant weight in certain financial circles. I could feel Marcus tensing beside me. He had never once asked about my family beyond the most surface-level questions. He had assumed poor meant unimportant and had never bothered to look deeper. That assumption was now unraveling in real time, in front of every person whose opinion his family cared about. Patricia found me before I found her. She had been tracking me through the crowd, and when she finally cornered me near the rose garden, her composure was still intact, but only barely. She gripped my arm harder than was polite and demanded to know what I was doing. I asked what she meant. She said she knew exactly what she meant. The dress, the jewelry, the stories I was telling people about my grandmother and my job. She wanted to know what my game was. I told her there was no game. I was simply being myself. She said that was impossible because Marcus had told her about my circumstances. She said I was a secretary who lived in a studio apartment and drove a car that belonged in a junkyard. I said Marcus had made certain assumptions, and I had never claimed otherwise. I said I worked in tech, which was true. I said I had a support role, which was also technically accurate. I said I had simply never corrected what they chose to believe. Patricia's face went very still. I looked at her directly and said my grandmother taught me that a person's true character only shows when they think no one important is watching. I said I had wanted to know who the Whitmore family really was. Now I knew. Before she could respond, Harold's voice came over the speaker system announcing that it was time for the toasts. The stage at the far end of the tent was dressed in flowers and soft lighting that was meant to feel romantic, but now felt like a reckoning waiting to happen. Harold welcomed the crowd with practiced warmth, talking about family and tradition and strong partnerships. Patricia took the microphone next, her composure locked back into place, her frozen smile fully operational. She spoke about her son finding a wonderful young woman. She hinted at exciting business developments and new strategic alliances, laying the groundwork for whatever announcement she had planned to tie the engagement to the Castellano deal. Then she called Marcus to the stage, and then she called me. I set down my champagne, walked through the silent crowd, and climbed those steps. Patricia handed me the microphone with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. She said she was sure I wanted to say a few words. I looked out at the crowd. I looked at Marcus. I looked at Patricia, who still believed she was in control of this evening. I said yes, I did want to say a few words. I thanked Patricia for the warm welcome she had shown me over the past several weeks. The crowd shifted, sensing something in my tone. I said that when I first came to the Whitmore home, I had made a deliberate decision to present a simple version of myself, a woman without expensive clothes or impressive credentials, a woman they might consider beneath their notice. I said I had wanted to see how they would treat someone they believed had nothing to offer. The tent went completely silent. I said what I found was illuminating. I described the dinner where I was compared unfavorably to Marcus's ex-girlfriend before the appetizers were finished. I described the whispered insults Patricia thought I couldn't hear. I described being called the help within 60 seconds of walking through the front door. I described being called common at the dining table by a woman who never once asked a genuine question about who I was. Patricia's face had gone white. Marcus was staring at me with an expression I had never seen on him before, horror layered over something that might have been guilt. I said, and then I heard something I was not supposed to hear. The crowd leaned in almost visibly. I described the conversation through the open door. I described Vivian and Patricia discussing how to remove me from Marcus's life once their business arrangements were secured. I described learning that I was a placeholder, someone to keep Marcus occupied while the family worked out his real future with Alexandra Castellano. Gasps moved through the crowd like a wave. I said the Whitmore dealerships were in serious financial trouble and that the Castellano merger was not a strategic choice, but a desperate attempt at survival. I said Marcus had maintained his relationship with Alexandra the entire time we were engaged. Then I held up my phone and showed the photograph. Marcus and Alexandra at a corner table, his hand covering hers, her fingers touching his face. I said this was taken 2 weeks ago while he was supposedly working late. The tent erupted. Marcus grabbed my arm and said it wasn't what it looked like. I told him he'd had the chance to tell me the truth the night before and chosen to lie while looking me directly in the eyes. I turned back to the crowd and said there was one more thing. I looked toward the back of the tent where Vivian stood frozen. I said Vivian Whitmore had been embezzling from the family company for years, starting small and growing over time, until the total reached into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Vivian shouted that it was a lie. Her husband turned to look at her with an expression that said he wasn't entirely surprised, which was somehow worse than shock. Richard Hartley stepped forward from the crowd carrying a folder of documentation, years of bank records and transaction histories, and handed it directly to the manufacturer's representative, who had been moving closer to the stage with the focused expression of a man confirming his worst suspicions. I reached up and removed the engagement ring from my finger. The cloudy diamond caught the chandelier light and revealed every flaw. I said I would not be marrying Marcus Whitmore. I said the only reason I had accepted his proposal was to give this family enough rope. I handed the ring back to Marcus and told him to give it to Alexandra. She was clearly the one he actually wanted. He said that wasn't true. He said he had real feelings for me. He said Alexandra was just business, something his mother had arranged. I said that was exactly the problem. He had let his mother arrange his relationships, his loyalties, his future. He had never once defended me when his family attacked me. He had lied to my face when I gave him every opportunity to come clean. A man who could not be honest with the woman he claimed to love was not a man I wanted to build a life with. I set the microphone down on the podium and walked off that stage.
The crowd parted for me like water. No one spoke. No one reached out to stop me. Behind me, the tent dissolved into chaos, and I didn't look back, but I heard everything. Patricia's voice rising high and desperate, insisting there had been a misunderstanding, that I was clearly disturbed, that none of what I had said was accurate. But the room had heard the evidence. The room had seen the photograph. The room had watched Richard hand that folder to the manufacturer's representative, and no amount of Patricia Whitmore's practiced composure could rewind those 60 seconds. The narrative she had spent years constructing was coming apart in real time in front of every person whose opinion she had ever cultivated. I heard the manufacturer's representative speaking into his phone near the exit, his voice clipped and professional, the voice of a man making a decision that had probably been building for months and had just found its final justification. I heard other guests moving toward the exits, creating distance between themselves and the disaster unfolding inside. In the world these people inhabited, association was everything. Nobody wanted to be photographed standing next to a family whose secrets had just been read aloud from the stage. I passed Vivian on my way out. She had cornered her husband near the bar and was talking fast, hands moving, trying to explain or justify or reframe. His face was stone. He was looking at her like the woman he had married had been quietly replaced by someone else entirely, and he was only now being informed of the switch. Harold was sitting in a chair near the entrance to the tent, with his head in his hands. The patriarch of the Whitmore Empire, built across 3 states over 30 years, brought low not by a competitor or a market crash, but by the exposure of everything his family had chosen to hide. I had genuinely felt nothing toward Harold throughout this entire process. He had always seemed more exhausted than cruel, a man who had learned long ago that arguing with Patricia was a losing proposition and had simply stopped trying. But exhaustion is not innocence. Looking the other way is still a choice. I kept walking. Marcus was still on the stage when I last glimpsed him, standing alone under the soft lighting that had been arranged to celebrate a future that no longer existed, the rejected ring still in his hand. His expression was something I couldn't fully name and didn't need to. Whatever Marcus Whitmore was feeling in that moment was the consequence of every choice he had made over the past 14 months. He had chosen deception over honesty. He had chosen his mother's approval over basic integrity.
He had looked me in the eyes the night before and lied without hesitation. Whatever grief he was experiencing now was real, I didn't doubt that, but grief is not the same as innocence either. Richard found me by the fountain a few minutes later, away from the noise and the unraveling. The night air was cold and clean, and I stood there breathing it in like I had been underwater for weeks and had finally broken the surface. He said it was done. He said the manufacturer's representative had already made the call. The Whitmore franchise agreement would be terminated by the end of the month. Without the ability to sell new vehicles, the dealerships couldn't function. Without functioning dealerships, there was no Whitmore empire, just a family name attached to a debt that would take years to resolve. I asked Richard if he felt satisfied. He was quiet for a moment before he answered. He said satisfaction wasn't quite the right word. He said it felt more like relief, like something that had been unresolved for a very long time had finally been settled. I understood exactly what he meant. He asked what I would do next. I said I would go home. I said I would sleep well for the first time in weeks. I said I would wake up tomorrow and return to the life I had built for myself, the one that had existed before Marcus Whitmore and would continue long after him. Richard nodded and handed me his business card. He said if I ever needed anything, I should call. He said he owed me one. I tucked the card into my purse, thanked him, and walked to the valet station. The attendant who had asked if I was with the catering company handed back my keys without meeting my eyes. I drove away from the Whitmore estate without looking in the rearview mirror. The drive home was quiet. No radio, no phone calls, just the road and the night, and the gradual loosening of something I had been holding tightly for weeks. When I finally reached my apartment, I sat in the car for a long moment before going inside. I thought about Marcus, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of tired clarity. I thought about how close I had come to building a life inside that family, to spending years being managed and manipulated and quietly diminished by people who would never have seen me as anything more than a variable in their financial planning. I thought about my grandmother and the letter in my nightstand and the lesson she had given me that I had carried into that estate and out the other side. And then I went upstairs, made a cup of tea, changed into my old comfortable robe, and sat by the window watching the city lights. 1 week later, a news alert appeared on my phone over morning coffee. The headline read that Whitmore Automotive was facing closure after franchise termination. The article detailed the manufacturer's decision, cited concerns about financial management and ethical practices, and mentioned that several former business partners had come forward with their own complaints. It noted that an internal investigation had revealed financial irregularities under review by authorities. It mentioned that Patricia Whitmore had been asked to step down pending further inquiry. My name appeared nowhere in the article. I had asked Richard to keep it that way, and he had honored that completely. This was never supposed to be my story. It was always theirs. I just made sure the ending was honest. Marcus texted me that same morning. He said he needed to see me. He said he could explain everything. He said he still cared about me and asked if we could meet just to talk. I read the message once, then deleted it without responding. Some doors, once closed, are better left closed. Not out of bitterness, not out of cruelty, but because some chapters are finished and reopening them doesn't serve anyone. Marcus needed to learn the lessons his mother never taught him, and he couldn't do that with me standing in front of him as a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. I stood at my window that morning watching the sun come up over the city and thought about what my grandmother had written in that letter, the one I still keep in my nightstand. She wrote that a person's true character only shows when they think no one important is watching. The Whitmores had believed I was nobody. They had believed I was common, naive, disposable, too grateful to question anything, and too simple to understand what was happening around them. They had shown me exactly who they were because they believed it was safe to do so. That was their mistake, and it was the only mistake that mattered. I touched my grandmother's pendant at my throat and got ready for work. My regular job at my regular company, doing the work I loved, surrounded by people who respected me for my skills and my character, rather than my connections or my willingness to play along. The Whitmore story would continue unfolding in courtrooms and boardrooms, and I wished them nothing, not harm, not relief, just the natural consequences of the choices they had made. That was enough. My own story was continuing too, written on my own terms, according to my own values, in a life that was entirely mine. That is what my grandmother gave me, not just the money, not just the business contacts, not just the name that still opened doors in certain circles. She gave me the understanding that worth is not assigned by people like Patricia Whitmore. It is built quietly over years through integrity and hard work, and the refusal to let anyone else define what you deserve. I already knew who I was. I had always known. I just needed the Whitmores to show me that I was right. Thank you so much for staying until the very end of this story. It genuinely means everything to me that you are here. If this hit you in any way, if it made you think or feel or want to call someone who underestimated you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the Revenge Room. New stories are always coming, and you do not want to miss what is next. I will see you in the next one.